Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this committee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. As a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they're not being recognized to minimize disturbances while members are asking questions of our witnesses. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not being recognized and there is an inadvertent background noise. Members are reminded that all House rules related to order and decorum apply to this remote hearing. Members are also reminded that they may participate in only one remote proceeding at a time. If you're participating in today's hearing, please keep your camera on. And if you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. Members wish to be recognized during the hearing, please identify yourself by name to facilitate recognition. Members are reminded that your questions and answers are limited to 5 minutes. To elaborate just a bit, I do ask that you please try to get your answer as well as your question in within the 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will sound at the end of your time. The title of today's hearing is Ensuring Equitable Delivery of Disaster Benefits to Vulnerable Communities and Peoples, an examination of GAO's findings of the CDBG-DR program. I will now recognize myself for 3 minutes to give an opening statement. In 2020, Chairwoman Waters and I tasked the Government Accountability Office, GAO, with assessing the degree to which federal disaster recovery resources are meeting the unique needs and challenges of vulnerable populations in the wake of natural disasters. Vulnerable populations too often include high poverty areas, racial minorities, persons with limited English proficiency, persons with disabilities, as well as the elderly. In their report, the Government Accountability Office recommends that going forward, HUD should collect, analyze, and publish demographic data from CDBG-DR grantees on vulnerable populations who apply for assistance, as well as those who receive it. It's important to note that data collection necessitates cooperation from grantees such as the state of Texas. Texas was awarded more than $4 billion for Hurricane Harvey relief, with nearly half still unspent due to the state's action plan being incomplete, as indicated in HUD's January 7, 2022 letter to the Deputy Land Commissioner for the state of Texas. In the 116th Congress, Congresswoman Ann Wagner and I introduced legislation which not only addresses data collection, but also codifies and streamlines the data collection process as it relates to disaster relief. This legislation passed the House in 2016, and the 116th Congress. The latest iteration of the legislation is pending before the House and Senate. This concludes my opening statement. At this time, without objection, I'd like to place the following documents in the letter. H.R. 4707, Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, the Department of Housing and Urban Development letter of disapproval for the Texas GLO's State Community Development Block Grant Mitigation Action Plan Amendment, GAO report number GA022104452 entitled Disaster Recovery, Better Data Are Needed to Ensure HUD Block Grant Funds Reach Vulnerable Populations. GAO highlights summary of Report GAO 22104452, disaster recovery better data are needed to ensure HUD block grant funds reach vulnerable populations. At this time, I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Emmer, for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Where you recognize? Mr. Emmer, you may be muted. Mr. Emmer. Franklin, can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Green, I can hear you.
Okay, I assume that Mr. Emmer can hear me. Perhaps I should go on to another member of the committee in his stead. All right, we'll come back to Mr. Emmer. The chairwoman of the full committee has been given 1 minute of time. Let's have the chairwoman.
If you can hear me, I am here.
Oh, okay. Well, Mr. Emmer, I'm sorry, we could not hear you.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing today, and I thank our witnesses for appearing before this committee. I look forward to their testimony. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program is one of several ways Congress and the federal government assist in the local disaster recovery process. It's supposed to swiftly meet the needs of our most vulnerable communities and help small businesses recover from the most severe natural disasters. It's also supposed to provide targeted relief so affected communities can rebuild homes and infrastructure, so affected businesses can reopen and support their communities. But instead, the program has a history of waste, fraud, and abuse. Time and time again, we see examples of grantees misusing disaster recovery money for purposes outside the scope of approved action plans. Or we see bureaucratic gridlock in distributing funds appropriately, or we even see appropriated funds remaining unspent even decades after a disaster. For these reasons, it's become apparent to this subcommittee that the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program fails in its objective to address the unmet needs of the most targeted, vulnerable communities. That's a problem. Why is this the case? How can we eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse within the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program so funds reach those who need it most? I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and investigating this topic today, and I applaud my colleagues, Chairman Green and Representative Wagner, for their continued work to protect this program from waste, fraud, and abuse. When disasters strike, aid must be delivered as effectively and efficiently as possible. This can only be achieved through proper oversight of the program. I'm proud that this committee shares this priority. However, some of my colleagues propose to fix the program by appropriating money in advance of a disaster, rather than waiting to see if there are unmet needs after agencies like FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers provide immediate relief. That's a bad idea. Natural disasters vary in size, severity, and occurrence. For this reason, we should not subject the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program to annual congressional appropriations. This would be a less than responsible and preemptive use of taxpayer dollars, and it could result in a misjustice to the vulnerable communities the assistance is designed to support. As we will explore in this hearing, communities are currently left without a clear understanding of where to turn and how to properly access the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds. If responsibly codified, this program will establish a clear, streamlined structure so all parties involved in distributing relief to communities understand the process and the guidelines. The Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of the Inspector General has spent years conducting audits and investigations of this program, revealing potential for mismanagement and the possibility of waste, fraud, and abuse. The Government Accountability Office recently completed a report investigating this program's effectiveness at reaching the most vulnerable populations. I look forward to the witnesses' testimony so we can further our efforts to protect vulnerable communities in times of disaster, increase transparency, and establish the proper structure and oversight so funds can be swiftly distributed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Emmer, for your very kind words, and the gentleman yields. At this time, the chair now recognizes the vice chairwoman of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Georgia, for 1 minute, Ms. Williams.
Thank you so much, Chairman Green. My home city of Atlanta, unfortunately, has the largest racial wealth gap in the country. On this committee, a big part of our job is making investments that help close that racial wealth gap. At the same time, though, it is our responsibility to guard those most marginalized against shocks that could further widen the racial wealth gap. That's why today I look forward to the conversation about ensuring disaster relief is accessible to members of vulnerable populations. For my district, natural disasters aren't just an abstract concern. My home county, Fulton County, is currently tied for the first place as the most tornado-prone county in the state of Georgia. I'll especially never forget the $500 million worth of damage a 2008 tornado did to metropolitan Atlanta. And I'll never forget the 500-year floods in 2009 that resulted in 10 deaths and another $500 million in damage. My constituents have seen and will see again natural disasters. It's our job to make sure that our government is prepared to help all the people get back on their feet. And no disaster takes us backward when it comes to closing the racial wealth gap. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. The gentlelady's time has expired. I will now welcome each of our witnesses and am pleased to introduce our panel. Mr. Daniel Garcia-Diaz is Managing Director for Financial Markets and Community Investment with the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Welcome. Ms. Diane Yentel is the President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Chrishelle Calhoun-Palay is Director of the Texas-based Home Coalition. Welcome to you as well. Andreanecia Morris is Executive Director of Housing NOLA. Welcome. Stephen Begg is Deputy Inspector of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Inspector General. Welcome to you as well. Welcome all. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that indicates how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime, so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statements will be made a part of the record. Once the witnesses finish their testimony, each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions. Mr. Garcia-Diaz, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on GAO's recent report on how CDBG-DR serves vulnerable populations. Our work confirms that certain populations face steep challenges in accessing help. CDBG-DR is focused on those who are poor of modest means, but some populations face additional hurdles in getting help. For example, the elderly or disabled may need transportation or reasonable accommodations. Disaster victims may not have access to the internet or may not be proficient in English to understand available resources. From an agency perspective, even identifying people in need can be challenging. Now, once disaster victims have been located or seek help, extensive documentation requirements can be difficult to comply with. So one of the tricky parts of this work was settling on a definition of vulnerable population. HUD has not always been clear about the term. We examined Federal Register notices since 2013, and the term has been evolving throughout that time. Our recent report describes efforts by grantees to develop outreach plans for such populations and offer special services. However, many that we spoke with at all levels expressed concerns about the lack of clarity around the term. In response to our report, HUD pledged to better define this in future Federal Register notices. This would certainly be a step in the right direction. And we certainly hope that The CDBG office includes its Office of Fair Housing as well as other critical stakeholders in its deliberations. However, even if vulnerable populations are better defined in the future, we remain concerned that HUD does not currently collect the data that it needs to fully assess how well the program is addressing unmet needs. So for instance, HUD only requires that grantees report on those who receive assistance, but not those who apply, even though the grantees collect the information on both applicants and recipients. We recommended that HUD gather, analyze, and make public additional data on both applicants and recipients across a range of demographic characteristics. HUD stated that it would work on this recommendation as part of an ongoing effort being led by OMB to improve the federal government's ability to assess whether programs have full and equal participation by all eligible individuals. In its response to our report, HUD also noted that such changes could require resources and investments, as well as consideration of privacy concerns, although its response did not detail what resources would be needed. We urge HUD to take steps to implement our recommendation, given the size and importance of the program in disaster recovery. Mr. Chairman, while the focus of this hearing is on how CDBG-DR serves vulnerable populations, we think the issues we found in our recent report are indicative of the bigger challenge with the federal approach to disaster recovery. After each disaster, individual federal register notices have been developed and grantee action plans must be submitted and reviewed. This is time-consuming and paperwork intensive, and it can also incentivize grantees to be more reactive rather than proactive in their disaster planning. GAO has previously recommended that Congress consider permanently authorizing the CDBG-DR program or some similar program to address the needs unmet by FEMA insurance or other resources, rather than continue to authorize it as a series of supplemental appropriations and HUD administer it through ad hoc notices. As you know, the current structure of CDBG-DR has contributed to delays in making funding available. Further, grantee capacity challenges in administering extraordinarily large grant amounts have added to the delays. We must keep in mind that these funding delays and grantee capacity issues directly and disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. A permanent program could meaningfully help speed up front end of this process and encourage more pre-disaster planning to prevent back-end delays. As potential reform options of CDBG-DR are weighed, three critical questions need to be considered. First, how does CDBG-DR fit into the broader set of federal programs? HUD's efforts don't exist in a vacuum. The current structure creates too many layers and too many players and creates confusions for applicants. Second, and unrelated, what is the underlying purpose of CDBG-DR? This is where Congress could give specific guidance and introduce accountability and transparency so that no part of disaster-affected communities is overlooked by CDBG-DR. And third, how will the capacity challenges in administering the program be addressed at the federal, state, and local level? Funneling money into organizations is risky if they do not have the capacity to manage it well. Building capacity at the grantee level, especially prior to a major disaster, is essential. Mr. Chairman, we at GAO have work underway to help the Congress understand these fundamental challenges and look forward to assisting the committee in its oversight and reform efforts going forward. This concludes my remarks, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia-Diaz. Your time has expired. Ms. Yentel, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Green, Ranking Member Emmer, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on ways to ensure that our nation's disaster rebuilding and mitigation efforts address the unique and often overlooked needs of the lowest income and most marginalized survivors, including people of color, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, and others. NLIHC has worked on disaster housing recovery issues for nearly 2 decades. And from this experience, we have found that America's disaster housing recovery system is fundamentally broken and in need of major reform. It's a system that does not address the unique needs of the lowest income and most marginalized people and the communities in which they live. And as a result, it consistently leaves them behind in recovery and rebuilding efforts and makes their communities less resilient to future disasters. The CDBG-DR and CDBG mitigation programs are vital recovery tools that provide states and communities with flexible, long-term recovery and mitigation resources needed to rebuild affordable housing and infrastructure after a disaster and to prevent future harm. Too often, however, these resources reach communities much too slowly, and they're diverted away from the people and communities with the greatest needs and for whom the programs were designed to serve. My written testimony provides multiple examples from disaster after disaster of how CDBG-DR recovery efforts tend to prioritize homeowners who are more likely to be white over renters who are predominantly Black and brown. In doing so, disaster recovery exacerbates racial wealth disparities and pushes more low-income renters of color into long-term housing stability and, in worst cases, homelessness. While Black and brown communities are often located in areas at higher risk of disaster with less resilient infrastructure to protect residents from harm, long-term recovery resources tend to go to white communities that face fewer risks. Rather than dismantling racial segregation, that is the direct results of intentional federal, state, and local policy, rebuilding efforts tend to entrench racial disparities and inequities. In my written testimony, I outline key barriers to equitable and comprehensive disaster housing recovery and our recommendations on how to reform CDBG-DR to ensure that these resources are deployed quickly, equitably, and effectively. Many of our recommendations are aligned with those made by the GAO in its recent report. NLIHC agrees with the GAO's recommendations related to increasing data transparency and equity. To better assess whether CDBG-DR funds are effectively reaching survivors with the greatest needs, HUD and grantees must collect, analyze, and make public key demographic data on the race, ethnicity, disability status, language preference, and other characteristics of program applicants and beneficiaries. Data transparency and an increased focus on equity must be central to any efforts to reform the CDBG-DR program, and HUD should implement these changes immediately. NLIHC also supports GAO's recommendation that Congress permanently authorize the CDBG-DR program. The Reforming Disaster Recovery Act would provide important safeguards and tools to help ensure that federal disaster recovery efforts reach all impacted households, including the lowest income and most marginalized people. The bill would quickly target resources to those with the greatest needs by requiring funds to be spent proportionately between homeowners and renters based on need, and by keeping in place the requirement that at least 70% of funds benefit low and moderate income survivors. The bill would prioritize data transparency and oversight by requiring HUD to create a public-facing dashboard summarizing how funds are being spent, requiring public input, and directing grantees to provide more details on how it would use the fund to serve the lowest income survivors. The bill would protect civil rights and fair housing by requiring that the funds be administered in compliance with fair housing and civil rights laws, and requiring HUD to release information publicly regarding disaster recovery efforts, disaggregated by race, geography, and all protected classes. And the bill would encourage mitigation and resiliency. Our country must reform existing disaster housing recovery systems to ensure that affordable housing investments and federal disaster recovery resources reach all impacted households. The Reforming Disaster Recovery Act would allow for important progress towards these goals and should be advanced and quickly enacted by Congress. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yentel. Time has expired. Ms. Calhoun-Palay, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give a full presentation of your testimony.
Good morning. And on behalf of the Houston Organizing Movement for Equity, thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I am Chrishelle Palay, Coalition Director of HOME, which was created in response to Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. HOME is a coalition of organizations that advocate for a just and equitable recovery. It's been 4 years since Hurricane Harvey, and the HOME Coalition continues working on behalf of families who still have not recovered. Harvey may have been natural in its formation, but after the water dried up and the volunteers fatigued, its aftermath continues to linger for people with fewer resources. And I don't speak rhetorically or anecdotally. Not only have I been involved in disaster recovery advocacy for over 10 years, but I also reside and am raising a family in one of the most flood-prone and disaster-impacted neighborhoods in Houston, Cashmere Gardens. Low-income survivors are forced to navigate complicated recovery assistance programs like FEMA, HUD, and SBA. And while each agency offers assistance programs open to everyone, no single agency has the sole responsibility and mission to assist low-income survivors. Households who are dependent on assistance must exercise extreme patience and remain in hazardous living conditions as they await a long approval process for program design and implementation. Households are also urged to apply for FEMA assistance, but fewer than half of applicants were granted assistance after Hurricane Harvey. And families have the ability to appeal their denials, but this just adds to the wait time for help. Those with financial means to cover immediate costs will be well on their way to recovery, while those without may be stuck for months or even years. Some homeowners who apply for home repairs through the city, county, or state are also still waiting. Following the state takeover of the program, those who apply for assistance from the city or the county were given the option to transfer to the state repair program. Some applicants were instructed to reapply, while others were assured that they had been approved. In almost a year since the transition, many homeowners today still don't have clear answers. Tenants have also had their fair share of challenges in receiving adequate assistance in response to Hurricane Harvey. They have largely been left out of the funding allocation or programming. A dedicated single agency must be established to address the needs of low-income survivors through the entire course of disaster response and recovery. The City of Houston spent only 1.8% of its $1.2 billion suballocation, causing massive delays in assistance for community members that needed it most. And this fact alone demonstrates the need for intentional agency collaboration and reliance on the lessons learned to inform program planning and ensure pre-existing capacity exists. There is no reason that all recovery efforts should start from scratch every single time. A shift in a positive direction is possible with the consideration of the following recommendations. Take an immediate first step by holding a joint hearing with witnesses from both FEMA and HUD to explore gaps and opportunities for coordination between agencies to serve low-income and marginalized communities. Require grantees to prioritize racial and social equity using a metric focused on the number of people or housing units protected instead of the current cost-benefit analysis. Adopt general standards to guide disaster recovery and mitigation efforts that centers communities' basic human rights. Storm survivors should have the right to stay and return home to neighborhoods that have adequate storm protection. They should have the right to choose whether and where they want to relocate. They should have the right to equal treatment. Every neighborhood, regardless of race, ethnicity, economic status, or disability, must be provided equitable levels of quality flood protection and equal access to essential public infrastructure. And they should have a right to have a say. Survivors must help design the recovery, know where they are in the process, and be empowered to speak and be heard in the language that best suits them. For a complete list of recommendations and observations, I encourage you to refer to my submitted testimony. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions and working with you to address these longstanding issues of equitable delivery of disaster benefits.
Thank you, Ms. Calhoun-Palay. Ms. Morris, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman, and thank you. Thank you all for having me here today and inviting me to this hearing to speak on this issue that drives so much of the work the organizations I am a part of over the last 16 years. Unfortunately, we in Louisiana are experts on these programs, as we far too often find ourselves in the path of a storm, both literal and figurative. And it feels as if we are constantly recovering from a natural disaster, yet we never seem to reach full recovery before the next disaster strikes. New Orleans in particular has long struggled with the challenges to provide for its most vulnerable residents, especially when attention is turns towards the next disaster. Hurricane Katrina's floodwaters 16 years ago required billions of private and public dollars to make the city livable. Redevelopment efforts increased the amount of quality housing, but it also drove prices and dramatically increased housing insecurity. Is displacement an inevitable byproduct of this kind of investment? Do the necessary and needed changes and improvement after a major catastrophe have to increase instability? I do not believe that needs to be the case. Still, the failure to plan for these outcomes and aggressively mitigate these issues is a pattern we are doomed to repeat again and again. In New Orleans, we're continuing to struggle to secure safe, decent, and affordable housing for all, while dealing with the confounding contradiction that there are thousands of vacant homes overpriced, thousands of blighted, unused property, and thousands of vacant and underdeveloped land. While housing insecurity and the lack of stable housing or shelter was a challenge before the most recent crisis, the pandemic, it is now a key issue that is going to make COVID recovery even more hard to accomplish. The connection between housing and community were lessons I thought we had learned during Hurricane Katrina, but those lessons have not been incorporated in our response to crisis after crisis. The resources pour in, and billions are used to rebuild a community, but the programs often fail to account for the needs of the vulnerable and the most hard hit after that crisis. This has led in New Orleans to homeowners, African American homeowners in particular, unable to build wealth and now finding themselves 33% of the community cost burden. Renters struggling to remain within housing limits, while housing costs continue to rise and wages are stagnant. After Hurricane Katrina, the city lost 100,000 African Americans who have not been able to return. This kind of systemic displacement is the result of a lack of living wage jobs and our city's failure to center the needs of the most vulnerable. Most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic and Hurricane Ida have once again tested the resilience of our city systems and exposed ongoing challenges to our housing stock, our economy, and our infrastructure. In hindsight, it is clear that recovery efforts need to center the needs of the most vulnerable, not the squeakiest wheel. Yet we do not meet the real needs of our community using clear and quantifiable metrics that assess the needs of the most vulnerable. This pattern of behavior has left us with weakened infrastructure and little capacity to actually become resilient. Instead, the people of Louisiana exist in a forced reality of living with less, simply because state and local governments don't center the needs of its people. Despite this pattern, the unprecedented influx of investment in our state that's pending could afford us another opportunity, another chance to make improvements, but we must heed the testimony of my fellow panelists today and make necessary improvements to these programs. A disaster, unfortunately, provides one more opportunity for traditionally marginalized participants to gain access to policymakers and advocate for policy proposals. Here in Louisiana, we've done that, and we have attempted to redefine the resiliency and quantify the needs of the people of Louisiana and demand that their issues be made front and center. The time is now for public partners and private entities to work together to make strategic investments. Our communities cannot continue to survive this way. The standard for success is simple. It must be whether or not a community is made better. Thank you for having me today on this incredibly timely topic, and I look forward to further conversations about this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morris. Mr. Begg, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about our disaster oversight work. It is my honor to represent the dedicated professionals of the HUD Office of Inspector General. I would like to take a moment to express, on behalf of the entire OIG staff, our deepest condolences for the tragic loss of life caused by the recent fires in Philadelphia and New York City. We are keeping the families affected in both cities in our hearts and prayers, and our office is closely monitoring the developments of those incidents. We appreciate the chance to assist this subcommittee in its oversight of HUD's disaster programs as it examines GAO's recent report assessing HUD's delivery of disaster recovery assistance to vulnerable populations. Our office has identified several key opportunities to improve HUD's disaster programs, most notably through codification. Both the OIG and GAO have recommended for several years that the CDBG-DR program be codified to provide a more consistent framework for administering disaster assistance. We thank this subcommittee and its staff for its bipartisan efforts to advance legislation in that regard. Codification will not eliminate the challenges HUD and its grantees face, but we believe that it would help disaster assistance reach victims sooner and produce better outcomes for them. HUD's current process of establishing program requirements through Federal Register notices takes months and, in extreme cases, years. Establishing a permanent framework of requirements would reduce the time it takes HUD to make funding available to grantees. It would also provide clarity and consistency for grantees about core requirements, which would allow them to plan and design programs more quickly and efficiently after a disaster occurs. We have also found that disagreements between grantees and their subrecipients over program requirements can delay the offering of assistance to victims. As the GAO report notes, funding delays often mean vulnerable populations with limited resources continue living in damaged or compromised homes while waiting for an opportunity to request assistance. Streamlining HUD's process and standardizing requirements could also help grantees build capacity to administer disaster grants that are massive in size and scope. Our work has identified that grantees can become overwhelmed early in the process as they lack the staff needed to stand up systems, design programs, and develop the policies needed to administer grants in accordance with HUD's requirements. These challenges increase the risk that grantees will not make the best use of funding. Capacity limitations can result in grantees being slow to gain approval to implement and offer programs to victims and to complete projects. The GAO report highlighted that capacity limitations often result in grantees struggling to reach the most vulnerable members of communities. Additionally, grantees with limited capacity are more likely to use funds for ineligible activities or be unable to detect and prevent fraud. Losing dollars to fraud or waste reduces the number of disaster victims that HUD's programs can assist. HUD must also remain vigilant in helping its grantees overcome spending challenges and holding them accountable. We recently reported that HUD had several tools available to identify and track slow spending disaster grantees. We found, however, that HUD does not require grantees to address their slow spending pace or resolve compliance issues until the time the grant is closed. We recommended that HUD requires grantees to resolve these issues in a more timely manner. It is important that HUD and its grantees take action earlier in the grant cycle to prevent important disaster assistance funding from being left on the table at the time of grant closeout. For several years, we have stressed the need for HUD to continue building its own capacity to oversee disaster grantees, and we commend HUD's recent efforts to increase staff dedicated to disaster oversight. It's important that HUD's staffing and technology keep pace with increases in the amount of disaster funding and the number of grantees it oversees. Looking forward, our office remains committed to helping HUD achieve its strategic objective to support effectiveness and accountability in long-term disaster recovery. We believe codification is an important step towards achieving that objective. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our disaster oversight work today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. At this time, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you quite well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also to the Chairwoman for holding this hearing. And to our witnesses, thank you for your testimony. When we discussed the need for Congress to finally codify CDBG back in July of last year, our witnesses painted a compelling picture. One, we heard about how states couldn't adequately prepare for disaster recovery because they didn't know how much emergency funding would flow to them. We heard that it took longer than it otherwise would have for HUD to get time-sensitive dollars out the door to communities in need. And we heard that different communities were not treated equitably, all because we haven't acted proactively. So, Mr. Yentel, in your testimony, you described the impact that disasters have on a region's housing stock. So can you share those findings with us now, and can you explain why it's critical that CDBG-DR dollars are used to support affordable housing?
Yes, Congresswoman, thank you for the question. Most communities have a severe shortage of homes that are affordable to the lowest income people even before disaster strikes. So nationally, for every 10 of the lowest income renter households, there are fewer than 4 apartments that are affordable and available to them. Then the disasters exacerbate these already severe shortages of affordable rental homes, and it has devastating consequences for the lowest income people, puts them at risk of displacement, evictions, and in worst cases, homelessness. One of the consequences after disasters is that the price for rent often increases dramatically. It's from a combination of the rapid loss in available housing stock due to the disaster itself. At the same time, there's increased demand because displaced renters and homeowners need new apartments. And sometimes it's simply price gouging by local landlords. So, for example, there were some zip codes in Houston where rents increased by 50% after Hurricane Harvey. And these kind of rapid increases, clearly the lowest income people can't afford, and they end up being displaced as a result. And also, affordable and accessible homes are most often located in areas that are most vulnerable to disasters, and the housing itself is more vulnerable. It's older, it's in poorer condition, it's located in flood zones, and it's less likely to be rebuilt after the disaster strikes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So let me ask you, I have another question for you. So I'm pleased to be here to discussing the GAO's report, since it confirms so many of the recommendations made by your organization. So can you discuss how Chair Green's legislation, HR 4707, would help eliminate the barriers that prevent the most impacted and lowest income survivors of disasters from achieving an equitable recovery?
Yeah, there's many ways that the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act could make recovery more equitable and prioritize and center the needs of the lowest income and most marginalized survivors. First off, just permanently authorizing the program would have a tremendous positive impact in that the money could get out faster. Congress and HUD wouldn't have to rewrite the rules every time a disaster strikes, so the money could get to communities faster. Communities would be required to prioritize the use of the funds for the lowest income people. They would be required to prioritize the needs of people with the most severe needs. They would be required to have proportionality, in other words, to ensure that the funds go equally to affordable housing, to economic revitalization, and to infrastructure. Very often communities prioritize infrastructure or economic revitalization over affordable housing, despite housing needs being the clearest and the most severe. It would also require really robust public consultations so that local communities could have a say in how these resources are used and how they get prioritized. And it would make some important changes to prevent displacement and prevent relocation where possible.
Well, thank you very much. I think I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you.
The gentlelady's time had not expired. You had about 15 seconds left.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to yield back to you those 13 seconds.
All right. The chair
Thank you.
receives
Thank you to that witness.
Thank you. At this time, the chair will now recognize a gentleman from Minnesota, the ranking member, Mr. Emmer, for 5 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I hear you quite well.
Excellent. The Department of Housing and Urban Development's Inspector General has identified and referred for prosecution several cases of fraud and abuse in the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, including public corruption, embezzlement, bid rigging, bribery, and kickback schemes. More broadly, there is a rich history of states using CDBG-DR funds for purposes that have no nexus to the original disaster. Mr. Begg, I understand your office has made a number of criminal referrals for fraud related to the CDBG-DR funds over the years. Can you share with us generally how those tend to be uncovered and prosecuted?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Emmer. Our office relies on whistleblowers frequently to uncover instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. And we receive many of the leads on those cases through our hotline. And we also work closely with HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development and grantees to train them on ways that they can identify and detect fraud, waste, and abuse, and ways that they can train their staff to make referrals to us of allegations of fraud. And so we generally rely on program participants and the general public to help us identify those cases. And we work with our partners at the Department of Justice to see that they're appropriately prosecuted.
Excellent. Thank you. Billions of dollars appropriated for prior disasters remain unspent today, including money appropriated for the 9/11 attacks, for Superstorm Sandy in 2012, and for storm damage in Mississippi back in 2008. The data is clear. CDBG-DR funds tend to remain unspent for years and years after HUD sends the funds to states. Mr. Begg, do you think having a pot of federal money sitting there for years and years is an invitation for fraud?
Yes, the longer that money remains available, the more likely it is that it's going to be used for ineligible activities, and it is susceptible to fraud, waste, and abuse. That's why it's important for HUD to remain diligent in its oversight and monitoring of slow spender grantees. And as we reported earlier this month, it's important for HUD to work with them to help them resolve their capacity issues and the root causes of why they're not spending funds more timely, so that money's not left on the table towards the end of the grant cycle when it's susceptible to rushed expenditures that may be indicative of waste or fraudulent activity.
Right. I mean, like the money from way back in the early years of this century, as a state becomes further removed from the original disaster in terms of time, and these large sums of money remain unspent, are you saying it does become more difficult? Or actually, I should ask the question, Mr. Begg, does it become more difficult for your office, maybe even not even your office? Let's concentrate on those that the money has been delivered to in the specific states. Does it become more difficult for even them to identify legitimate purposes for the money?
That's certainly possible. Another issue that we've identified is that those seeking assistance may also be confused as you get further and further away from a disaster event as to how to navigate HUD's programs in seeking assistance. For example, we recently identified that Texas disaster recipients did not know or may have been unaware of the fact that they were eligible for money from Hurricane Ike and Hurricane Harvey. And so the further you get away from the disaster and the longer it takes for those in need to request assistance, the more likely it is that they'll be unclear as to what's available to them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Begg. I know we just have a few seconds left. If you can, and maybe I'll follow up with you after this hearing, can you describe how codifying the program and including some guardrails and some oversight mechanisms might address some of these vulnerabilities your office has identified?
Absolutely. The main benefit that we see to codification is two-pronged, increasing the timeliness of the funding reaching grantees and then those in need. see the time has
I'll,
expired.
I'll follow up with you. Thank you, Mr. Begg. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, for 5 minutes of questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for bringing forth this hearing and these great witnesses. And I especially, of course, want to welcome Ms. Palay from Houston to the United States Congress. Mr. Chairman, this grant program provides essential assistance for communities deeply hurt by natural disaster, especially as noted in our Houston area that I represent. In the case of natural disasters, timing is critical. The previous witness mentioned that timing is critical. How quickly can we get the help to people who need it? Every day following a catastrophic event is a day that families go without food, without water, without shelter, without transportation, and their basic livelihood. What's concerning to me is that currently the Community Development Block Grant Program is not fully authorized in statute, so it is subject to the changing tides of local politics. It is not held to a consistent standard at the national level, and thus it's vulnerable to changes in rulemaking and grantee action plans. Although grantees are expected to comport with CDBG national objectives, this can differ by year and by the rulemaking put into place. As a result, there are vulnerabilities that result from basic turnover in government administrations that can allow grantees programs to falter in carrying out their duties. It is critical that we support and reinforce this program through permanent authorization and full enforcement of data collection so that we can accurately perceive how these funds are being used. In Houston, for example, following the 2015 flooding, the Disaster Recovery Program provided the City of Houston with a direct allocation funding that did not have to go through our state government. As a result, the funding was allocated swiftly to projects rebuilding the Houston communities that were hit the hardest. In contrast, the newly created Disaster Mitigation Fund, which was created in direct response to Hurricane Harvey, was not a direct allocation to our area that was hit by the hurricane. Instead, the funding went through the state, which has not yet to provide any of the $4.3 billion in federal taxpayer money to either the City of Houston or Harris County. In addition to allocating the funds to multiple other jurisdictions, while excluding the two largest communities hit by the hurricane, the state used the maximum allowable funds of 5% for administrative costs, 5%, which resulted in $250 million going to the state government. Now, this $250 million, Mr. Chairman, is more than the entire payroll of the Houston Astros. That's how much the state kept. I highlight this because it's profoundly concerning that these programs are not reaching the intended recipients who were most impacted by the hurricanes. We must find a way to get the money to those most in need swiftly, because people do suffer. Poor people become poor. Additionally, there is always never enough data to collect it at the federal level, so it's always difficult to assess what really has happened. So we must codify the disaster relief programs, but we must also work with HUD to access the communities that these programs are designed to work for. So my first question is for Mr. Garcia-Diaz. Mr. Diaz, in the report, as you stated in your testimony, you provided several cases for how this program can better target underserved populations, including data collection. You stated that while grantees can and do collect data, we're not collecting the data of those that apply, only of those that receive. Can you elaborate, please, on this point and what else that we should be doing so that we can get better information on the cultural and language barriers related to vulnerable populations, especially those with limited English?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman Garcia. That's absolutely right. I mean, data, especially for dealing with vulnerable populations, you need to know something about who they are and what their situation is like. And particularly if you want to make sure that the program is addressing their needs, you need good data both, and we emphasize this in the report, on the applicant side as well as the beneficiary side. And the reason we emphasize applicant data, which is something HUD does not collect at all, is that you need to know who is making it through and who is not making it through. And that's a critical part of holding the grantees and HUD itself accountable, that they're delivering assistance to the neediest population. And data is fundamental to that.
Thank you. And very quickly, and I know I'm running out of time, Ms. Yentel, could you elaborate any more on how we can better reach our limited English proficiency applicants?
Sure. Yes, if I have the time, I'd be happy to. For limited English proficiency applicants, HUD guidance directs grantees to ensure that disaster recovery activities meet language access requirements, but often communities don't. Puerto Rico is one of the most egregious examples after Hurricane Maria, where Spanish is the predominant language on the island, but CDBG-DR programs, the materials were in English, and only after significant pushback were they translated to Spanish, and there were multiple errors within it. So HUD requires that there be language access, but they could do more in terms of oversight and ensuring that that actually happens. And HUD could also learn a lot from Treasury and the implementation of emergency rental assistance programs, where successful grantees partnered with community-based organizations to reach marginalized communities, including those for whom English is their second language.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I've run out of time.
The gentlelady's time has long since expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk. 5 minutes of questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me kind of continue on what Mr. Emmer has started to ask about, and that's the absence of a permanent law or permanent statute for the CDBG-DR program. The absence of a permanent law governing the program means that when Congress activates the program after a natural disaster, which we've had plenty of recently, the parameters of the program have to be established on an ad hoc basis, and HUD must continue rulemaking every time new funds are allocated. Of course, this is going to lead to inefficiencies and delays with getting the funds distributed. Mr. Begg, you had started to touch on some of these issues, but unfortunately ran out of time. Can you describe the problems that result from the lack of permanent statute with this program and how enacting a statute to govern the program would help address those problems, and anything else that you'd like to discuss that Mr. Emmer had asked?
Certainly, thank you for the question. As I mentioned previously, codification of the program could help streamline HUD's allocation process. And we reported in April of 2021 that HUD engaged in lengthy negotiations with the Office of Management and Budget about program requirements that would be included in Federal Register notices for the 2017 disasters, which produced significant delays in making the announcements in the Federal Register notice, which in turn prevented grantees from finalizing and submitting action plans. And that in turn delayed HUD and the grantees from entering into grant agreements, which would give them access to the funding. So streamlining HUD's process through codification, we think, is an important step in speeding up disbursement of disaster recovery. But providing permanent authorization for the program would also clarify requirements for grantees so that they can plan earlier and for future disasters, so that they can implement programs disaster over disaster rather than waiting for HUD to announce specific waivers that really kind of keep them in gridlock while they're trying to figure out how to design programs for their communities in need.
Well, thank you. So we could still implement a codified law giving guidance, but still leave flexibility for the uniqueness of the disaster of a particular area?
That's correct. There's always going to be a need for flexibility at the local level, and our office understands that. What we've identified is the need for clarity and consistency up front, so that grantees and HUD can be in step on the plans and then the actions and milestones needed to result in getting money down to the ground level at the local level, where the flexibility can really be designed to benefit the individuals and vulnerable populations in need.
All right, thank you. Mr. Garcia-Diaz, could you also comment on the problems of not having this program codified, or the lack of legislation on it, and what could be resolved if we had it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think codification helps make CDBG-DR a real program with subject to all the requirements that all programs are expected to follow, including OMB requirements regarding fraud risk management. Of course, DR is subject to those requirements as is, but the more that the program is permanent, the more that everyone knows what the expectations are going forward and after a disaster, that's going to allow for preparation to occur not only at HUD, but also at the grantee level, because they know what to expect and they know that there's enough stability in the program that they can start thinking ahead about the future disasters and what they need to do to be positioned to best distribute those funds efficiently, effectively to these populations that sorely need the help, but also protect taxpayer interests here and ensuring that the right people are getting the funding, or eligible people are getting the funding.
Well, thank you. And while I have you, as you know, we need to balance the need to reduce waste with the need to distribute funds quickly. In the short amount of time I have, what changes do we need to make to ensure that funds are used for the intended purpose, but they're also distributed timely?
Yeah, and I think we have to build capacity both at HUD and at the grantee level to accomplish that. Speed and proper use of funds, they don't overlap completely. They can often diverge, and so there is that risk. We want to manage that, and we need capacity to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I yield back.
Time has expired. Thank you. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes of questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate us holding this hearing. You know, I've seen firsthand how disasters like flooding can devastate our communities, and the inequities in how those communities access and qualify for disaster relief. We can continue to fund various programs, but implementation is so critically important, especially in communities like mine. One of the most immediate and devastating impacts of disasters is always housing affordability for low-income residents. So, Ms. Yentel, you know, the organization you work for, which has been really critical in exposing just, you know, some of the broken systems that are in place and some of the really needs and policy change to making sure that we address those. You testified recovery and mitigation efforts typically favor higher income, predominantly white communities. And markets across our country are already, you know, squeezed because of lack of housing supply. Disasters often cause dramatic spikes in rental prices, leading to displacement, evictions, homelessness. We also know that nearly 1/3 of federally assisted housing stock is located in areas with very high, relatively high risk of negative impacts from natural hazards and so forth. So these communities are, you know, many of us call frontline communities of the climate crisis. So, Ms. Yentel, can you describe how natural disasters and inadequate disaster relief can displace low-income communities and communities of color, and really talk about what we can do as a legislative body to address those?
Sure, you touch on some very important issues around how low-income people are most likely to live in communities that are hardest hit by disasters, and they're most likely to live in housing that isn't built to withstand the storm itself. So they are vulnerable in multiple layers from the disasters. They're least likely to have the resources needed to evacuate prior to the disaster. They're least likely to have the resources or the social network to help them recover during the disaster, and they're most likely to be left behind in the recovery unless there's very focused advocacy and legislation that requires the prioritization of their needs in recovery. So when affordable housing stock is lost in disasters, it's virtually never recovered to the same degree it was pre-disaster. And as I shared earlier, pre-disaster, most communities have a severe shortage of homes that are affordable to lowest income people. So when we're losing when we're losing affordable housing stock that's affordable to those lowest income people, and communities are not prioritizing the repair and reconstruction of those affordable homes, then there is permanent displacement for the lowest income people, who are predominantly people of color, Black and Brown people. And one way this plays out as well is how these disaster resources are targeted. So time after time, disaster after disaster, we see that limited resources that Congress appropriates to communities after disasters are targeted towards higher income homeowners who are predominantly white at the expense of lower income renters who are predominantly Black.
Ms. Yentel, I do want to have some time because I want to get to some specifics around this, because flooding was a huge issue. I mean, up to four times in some of my residents' homes were flooded. So this is to all the witnesses on the panel. I'm curious to hear this. As floodplains have shifted with climate change and extreme weather events become more common, should funding and authorization of CDBG-DR also include updated flood mapping? Other question is, how should localities balance the need to build communities in more resilient, less flood-prone areas without discouraging the full replenishment of, affordable housing? I want to hear from everyone on the panel about this. Again, flood mapping is something that's been on my mind, and wanting to see if we should be, really laser focused on that to try to shift some of those resources again to those that impacted the most. Anybody on the panel can talk about that?
So
Sure.
I can be just real quickly. GAO has some work, and we can get to you with more details on FEMA's progress in improving their mapping capabilities. That's an area that has been a concern for us, and it has a lot of knock-on effect on every other program that seeks to either build affordable housing or recover it after a disaster. And so we can share some information there, but government decisions on funding should be based on the best available data and analysis, and FEMA, and particularly the NFIP program, is responsible for that.
I'm so sorry we didn't have a chance to hear from others. Thank you so much. And if you do have an answer, want to submit it to a committee, I welcome it. Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair will ask the witnesses to respond to the gentlelady's questions in writing. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff. 5 minutes of questions and answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and the ranking member for calling today's hearing. And thank you also to all the witnesses who are appearing virtually today. Mr. Begg, if I could with you, can you talk about the waiver process for these CDBG-DR grantees? How are waivers granted, if you will? And I guess, and without asking this is a leading question, are the waivers granted on an inconsistent basis?
Well, thank you for that question. In general, waivers are granted for, HUD has the authority to grant waivers from the traditional CDBG framework, which generally applies to CDBG-DR and CDBG-MIT funding. And so the Secretary has discretion when appropriate to waive requirements or create alternative requirements that would benefit particular funding streams. And in certain instances, grantees have the authority to make certain waivers of their own program requirements. We haven't examined the consistency of those waivers across the portfolio necessarily, but one thing that we have seen is that the waivers can create confusion at times and lack of clarity for grantees. In one instance recently, we identified a scenario where the city of Houston was seeking a waiver of program requirements from Texas GLO regarding the rebuilding specifications for homes. And TGLO ultimately denied the waiver, but they spent a lot of time disagreeing with the city of Houston about whether it was appropriate, because if they granted that waiver to the city of Houston, it might produce an inequitable result for other cities and counties across their state in the distribution of the Hurricane Harvey relief funds. So the waiver process is designed to get at the flexibility issue we discussed earlier, but it does come with risks that need to be managed and assessed.
All right. Well, and I do appreciate that answer. And I think what you just said, that regardless of who the HUD secretary is, whoever he or she is, if a waiver is granted, there are no clear guidelines as to the parameters of the waiver or waivers. Is that right?
There are certain aspects of the program that can't be waived, like fair housing and environmental reviews, but in large part, there are many options for waivers consistent with what you said.
You know, during your questioning or the questioning of everybody this morning, there's been a great deal of talk about codification that Chairman Green and Congresswoman Wagner have worked on, and others. Does the waiver process beg for some direction in terms of codification? In other words, should there be codifications about what lanes, avenues, directions the waivers can be granted by the HUD secretary?
Waivers ultimately are a policy call for Congress and HUD secretary and leadership to make. What our office's role is generally to look at whether the waivers and the program execution is achieving goals effectively and efficiently. And so to the extent that waivers continue to be part of the process for CDBG-DR program execution, what we would focus on is looking at ensuring that those waivers work and they produce the intended effective outcomes for the individuals in need.
If there was abuse in the waivers somewhere in the process or after the waiver was granted, your office would investigate, right?
Absolutely.
In terms of making your work easier, if you were waving a magic wand and were working on codification, what are some of the parameters that you would look to codify?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, streamlining HUD's allocation process is a critical component. And in Chairman Green's bill, one benefit we see is the enhanced deadlines that are in place to ensure that HUD and its grantees are moving through the various gates of announcing allocations, reviewing and approving action plans, and then entering grant agreements.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for holding this important hearing on the CDBG-DR program. And I thank our witnesses for joining us today. At the same time, when disasters seem more and more frequent, CDBGR oversight is unfortunately an extremely important topic. The devastating events that have taken place in Puerto Rico in the last few years, from Hurricane Maria to the devastating earthquakes, have affected me personally, along with many of my constituents in Chicago. I traveled to the island to look at recovery efforts, and I don't have to tell you that it's been slow going. Challenges in the CDBGR-DR allocation process are no small part of it. To Ms. Yentel, in your testimony, you highlighted some of the challenges that Puerto Ricans have faced with CDBG-DR funds after Hurricane Maria. It's serious stuff. One CDBG-funded program only released housing resources in English, only translating them after protests. Many homeowners in floodplains have not been able to get help at all, leaving them vulnerable to displacement, and small local construction companies have been left out of contracts. And it feels like Puerto Rico has been left behind time and time again. Ms. Yentel, do you think that HUD is sensitive to the needs of Puerto Rico and its recovery? And do you think that the GAO's recommendations for the CDBG-DR program will meaningfully improve disaster relief efforts on the island?
I do think it will. It would make a significant difference for people who were harmed by Hurricane Maria and for people who may be harmed by future disasters. Puerto Rico is an especially egregious example of how disaster recovery and rebuilding don't work for the lowest income people when local communities especially are often shut out of the conversation about how these resources should be used. Those local communities and impacted people should be leading the conversations about how resources should be used, about how questions of relocation should be considered. And certainly, at the very least, materials about available resources should be made available in the relevant language to the communities. And none of that has been true in Puerto Rico. Advocates and impacted people have fought their way to the table and been able to make some improvements to programs, but it shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't take that level of effort. It should be automatically built into the system that communities have a say in how these resources are used. And one of the improvements that this bill would do is require really robust community consultation and especially consultation with communities that are most impacted by the disaster.
So to my first question, would that be a yes or a no on the sensitivity of HUD to their needs?
In terms of the sensitivity of HUD, yes, unfortunately, it's been a political question, right? The previous administration created many unnecessary obstacles and blocks to getting the money even to the island. This administration has a different approach and is prioritizing the needs of Puerto Ricans and being much more sensitive to their needs.
Thank you for that. To Mr. Begg, the GAO's report found that vulnerable people face obstacles to accessing relief through the CDBG-DR program. That's troubling for my community hit by a natural disaster, for any community. But it's especially troubling in Puerto Rico, where English is not the primary language and the average incomes are lower than they are in the continental US, and more people live in informal housing. Can you discuss what steps HUD can take to deliver relief to the people of Puerto Rico specifically?
Thank you for the question. The steps that HUD can take to assist Puerto Rico are similar to the steps that it can take to assist all grantees. Technical assistance and oversight and monitoring of progress in the grant is critical from the HUD perspective to ensure that when grantees are facing challenges, either in reaching their communities or in executing their programs or establishing them as a threshold matter, it's important that HUD step in and do what it can through technical assistance to make sure that the grantees have everything they need from HUD to be successful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to begin by thanking you for your work with Congresswoman Wagner to reform the CDBG-DR program and ultimately help the communities across our country who have suffered from natural disasters, whether they be hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, or wildfires. When these disasters strike, the communities that are least able to properly recover often end up being the hardest hit. When functioning properly, the CDBG-DR program can provide invaluable support to low and moderate income communities reeling from devastating natural disasters. Knowing this, it is critical that this program be transparent and accountable to ensure the taxpayer dollars that fund this critical program are directed to the right people and only spent on appropriate disaster recovery related needs. And of course, the program must be quick and efficient in responding to the various disasters that will inevitably come. Mr. Begg, your report showed that fraud prevention is something that needs to be addressed for CDBG-DR, and I know that we've been discussing codification a lot today, but I'm curious, do you think if Chairman Green and Congresswoman Wagner's bill to codify the program was to become law, would it be easier for HUD to identify and prevent fraud? And would codifying the law help with the staffing capacity issue identified in the report?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. We certainly believe that codification is an important step towards eliminating opportunities for fraud, waste, and abuse. But as I mentioned in my opening statement, it's not a cure-all. for all of the problems that grantees and HUD face in successfully executing disaster recovery assistance programs. Preventing improper payments and reducing the opportunities for fraud is something that our office has stressed over the years. In our recent Top Management Challenges report, we identified fraud risk management as a top challenge for HUD across the department, but specifically within disaster recovery. And our colleagues at GAO last year published a report examining the steps that HUD's taken to assess fraud risks in the DR program specifically. We believe that HUD's action on those recommendations from GAO to comprehensively assess fraud risk within the DR program is a key step in identifying and understanding fraud risk so that the department and its grantees are in a position to mitigate and prevent that fraud.
Sure, no, thank you for that. Also, would a streamlined rulemaking process help reduce fraud as well?
Yes, we think so. We think it could help, certainly. As I mentioned earlier, the longer that funds sit out there and they're not spent to address unmet disaster recovery needs, the more likely it is that they could be used for ineligible purposes, and that opens the door to potential fraud.
Sure, thank you. Lastly, I want to focus on how this program needs to be streamlined and become more efficient, which is obviously something codifying the program would help with. When disaster strikes, this type of relief needs to get out the door as quickly as possible while still maintaining the security and integrity of the program. Mr. Begg, again, where in the CDBG-DR program can we cut red tape while still allowing the program to remain flexible so it can successfully respond to the various natural disasters we deal with in our country?
One area that we've highlighted frequently is consistency around the core requirements of the programs. Generally, the programs are designed to do a handful of things, and by codifying permanently authorizing the program statute and requiring HUD to establish permanent regulations outlining program requirements, we think that will help grantees focus and plan better so that they don't engage in endless disagreement or endless pursuit of perfection in their program design, and they can start implementing around the core simplified requirements in the regulations.
Sure, thank you for that. I'll end with, I think the burdensome Federal Register notice process seems like a good place to start. It has to be really tough for grantees when there are so many changes to the original requirements, and we need to really make it very transparent what we're expecting from them so we can be efficient with this program. I really appreciate you being here virtually, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, 5 minutes of questions and answers. Mr. Cleaver, you may be on mute.
Thank you. The CDBG-DR is extremely important, and I had to deal with it for about 20 years when I was in municipal government. And one of the problems that we had in Missouri, in Kansas City, after a couple of 500-year floods that occurred over about 3 years, was the whole issue of trying to get it dealt with when it's not permanently authorized. I'm wondering if I'm not sure what the historical reason for not doing the permanent authorization, but I am familiar with the fact that we don't need delays in the midst of a disaster. Where we got to get presidential or congressional authorization, and it just delays what the government can do, and it creates frustration. And I'm wondering if there is anyone who has any reason why it should not be permanently authorized, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult for me to ever see this as something that is okay. Okay, anybody else? So everybody agrees with me that we need to permanently authorize.
GAO has made a recommendation to Congress to consider making the program permanent. We think there are very compelling reasons for doing it. And I don't think the status quo is really acceptable going forward, given the size, scale, and frequencies of these disasters.
Yeah, is there any? I wish I could, go back in history to find out why. And maybe even if we found out why, it still doesn't make sense. But it's something that I'm hoping we can do. The chair of the committee, Chairman Green, and I've had some discussions about this because we're taking a pretty in-depth look at CDBG program, period. And one of the things that we've talked about is hopefully we can get this CDBG, which is not, a very complicated piece of legislation, including the DR program. So I appreciate your comments. Are there any programs in the federal government that any of you know of that is already that can respond quickly? What is the fastest program we have to respond to a disaster? Anybody?
Well, obviously, those are the FEMA programs done
Yes.
by the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Those programs are on the ground immediately, and there's got to be conversation about integrating those programs with the CDBG-DR more effectively, more impactfully. And one thing I would say, Congressman Cleaver, while I certainly do not object to the notion of codification of the CDBG-DR, I would like to add that we need to also see reform. And we need to see reform that centers the needs of the most vulnerable. We've talked a lot today about fraud and waste management, and what we seem to be losing the thread on is the people who are left behind. If funds are misappropriated by contractors and used for other things, that increases the number of people who are left behind. And often, I must say, the notion of fraud and waste management or mismanagement is often used to disenfranchise the most vulnerable in the name of checking boxes and making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. The most vulnerable are often ignored and often excluded from these programs. And that is something that must be said. So while I appreciate and agree wholeheartedly that these funds must be managed appropriately, the notion of we must also be careful about continuing to stigmatize the people who desperately need these programs. When we say fraud and mismanagement permeates these programs, we have to be clear that that is often by administrators and contractors who are hired by grantees, not the recipients themselves.
Well, okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair will now recognize the Chairwoman, the Vice Chair of the committee, Williams, for 5 minutes of Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You almost gave me a promotion there.
I did.
In Atlanta, there are only 29 affordable and available housing units for every 100 extremely low income renter households. As we've already heard today, any disaster can further stress the shortage that we have in my district and across the country. Not only do we have to invest in our long-term affordable rental housing stock now, but we also have to be sure that we take the same approach when disaster strikes. Ms. Yentel, in your testimony, you mentioned that HUD has the authority to reject state action plans that favor homeowners over renters. What else can HUD do proactively to ensure that the plans that come to them equitably provide disaster relief for renters?
I'd say one of the most important things that they could do right now, that is part of the GAO's recommendations to them, is require of themselves and grantees more data transparency. So to collect information on who's applying and the demographics of who's applying and who is or is not getting resources, who's being accepted and who's being denied. I think just in having that kind of data transparency, it will become very clear what people on the ground and people who've been doing this work for a long time know, which is that there are significant disparities in who receives resources, disparities between lower and higher income people, and disparities between people of color and communities of color and white communities. So that data transparency is really essential.
Ms. Yentel, after a disaster, rebuilding apartments and homes is critical to ensuring those most impacted have a place to live and don't see their wealth permanently impacted. As we make investments to rebuild communities, we have the opportunity not only to prevent a widening racial wealth gap, but also to reinvest funds back into impacted communities and people. How can HUD make sure that the money invested in local recovery more often goes to local businesses and creates local jobs? How would this help ensure recovery efforts are a credit to closing the racial wealth gap in a place like Atlanta, which leads the country?
Yeah, it's a very important point because a lot of times these resources go to contractors to run the programs, and these contractors often are not grounded in the communities that are impacted. They're out of state, they're out of city, and they're profiting from the administration of these programs, and many times they're doing it well. Sometimes I will say there's also egregious examples where they're doing it poorly and yet get rehired after future disasters. But most importantly, it's not creating the local infrastructure to be able to respond to disasters in the future. These kind of significant resources going to communities can not only serve the primary purpose of rebuilding apartments and making homes affordable for lowest income people where homes have been destroyed, but they can also create local jobs and create local expertise. So then that community has more and better capacity to respond to future disasters. And that's a place where HUD can do more. And they have been of late doing more in this administration to really look more closely at state and local action plans and how they're using CDBG. And as with the case in Texas just recently, going back and saying, we're not going to accept this action plan until you do more to ensure that these resources are going to the communities and to the people who have the greatest needs.
And Ms. Yentel, I'm sorry to make it feel like you're in the hot seat, but in your testimony, you also emphasized the importance of sharing data on disaster recovery with academic and research institutions so that we can continue to understand equity issues in disaster recovery and identify potential solutions, one of my priorities here on this subcommittee. What current barriers remain to work with colleges and universities on this effort? And how can we prioritize partnerships with institutions like HBCUs that are well positioned to do this type of research?
Again, yes, it's so important, and it comes back to the importance of data transparency. And certainly there's some data that can't be released publicly because of concerns around privacy. But there are ways to mitigate those concerns, especially when sharing data with academic institutions. And it's critically important. There is very little data available nationally, despite the number of disasters that are occurring and despite the increased frequency. There's little data that's available about who is impacted, how they are harmed, how there are racial and other disparities in who is assisted and who's not. And that kind of data sharing is essential. There should be public transparency, and there should be greater data shared with academic institutions to provide this kind of analysis and provide it to members of Congress so that we're ensuring that public policy meets local needs.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now yields himself 5 minutes for questions and answers. Let me start by thanking all of the members, all of whom especially have spoken favorably to the legislation. And I especially have to thank, Ms. Wagner, for her Herculean efforts in helping with this legislation. Ms. Wagner, if you are listening, I want you to know that I appreciate greatly all you've done, as well as the chair of the full committee. Thank you. In Texas, we have what may be considered a unique circumstance. Harvey hit Houston in 2017, and we appropriate funds, some $4 billion+, and we still have funds that have not been utilized. Someone spoke of slow spenders earlier, I believe it was. Mr. Begg, I'm concerned about slow spending as well. I want to know from you, has there ever been a clawback or what typically is done when the slow spender becomes a no spender? Mr. Begg, if you would, please.
Thank you for the question, Chairman. I was having a little difficulty hearing you, but I just want to confirm that you were asking about what happens when slow spenders are identified as no spenders in terms of clawing back grant funding.
Yes, sir, that is correct, and I'm sorry about the volume.
No problem. In our recent review of HUD's oversight of slow spending disaster recovery grantees, what we've seen is that HUD actually has metrics built into its disaster recovery grant reporting system to identify at various stages of the grant whether grantees are meeting their expenditure targets and whether they're on pace to expend on a monthly basis the dollars that they need to exhaust the grant before closeout. One concern we have is that when some of those red flags in the system show that grantees are no spenders for 6, 12, 24 months, that HUD does not require the grantees to address those flags until the time of grant closeout. So the risk there, from our perspective, is that a no spending grantee could continue not using funding until the grant closeout, and money would be left on the table that HUD would then have to recapture, and it wouldn't be available to go to the communities and individuals in need.
Thank you. For the benefit of persons in Houston who may be tuning in, let me ask Ms. Yentel, would you explain to persons why we understand it's important for us to spend timely? And I'd also like to get Ms. Calhoun-Palay to respond, as well as Ms. Andreanecia. So if you'll be brief, it would be helpful. Ms. Yentel.
I'm so sorry, Congressman, I didn't quite hear the question, but maybe Mrs. Palay did, and she could start off with the response.
I'm speaking at my volume level higher than I've been speaking. So the question is, explain, if you would, why it's so important for the dollars to be spent timely. People in Houston would like to know that we understand this process and why it's so important. We'll start with you, Ms. Calhoun-Palay, if you would.
Sure. So the importance of timely spending of these funds is directly linked to the folks who are in most need of repairs and recovery. So what's happening on an ongoing basis, and even to this day, is that as applicants are waiting for responses, they're having to go through hoops, and there's a ongoing cycle of having to resubmit paperwork before the actual application gets approved and gets funded. So what happens in the meantime is that homeowners are sitting in black mold, continuing to sit in homes that have leaky roofs, and are just waiting. And in some cases, the guidance has been so ambiguous and vague, where some homeowners have started to try to recover on their own, and then once they're approved, are hearing that they're approved, they're told that they must stop. They must stop the ongoing construction in their home or repairs in their homes so that the city or whatever agency can come forward and complete those repairs. And so the waiting game has a hazardous impact on actual homeowners that are just in waiting. So that is one of the reasons why it's so timely or so important that spending timelines are really.
My time is about to expire. Thank you. Let me just end with this. I'm going to look at legislation to ascertain whether the funds can be.
Hello. I heard something and I was like.
The state to perform the function of appropriating the funds within the state. Having said this, my time has expired. And again, we'd like to thank each of the witnesses for their testimony and for committing the time and resources to share their expertise with the subcommittee. Your testimony today will help to advance the important work of this subcommittee and of the Congress. The chair notes that members may have additional questions for this panel, which they may wish to submit in writing. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 legislative days for members to submit written questions to the witnesses and to place their responses in the record. Also, without objection, members will have 5 legislative days to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members to submit written questions and materials for the record to the email address provided your staff. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you, one and all.